I hope everybody has fun with this. There's a lot of information in this webinar, and I'm going to go through it kind of quickly, and we'll do questions at the end. I hope it's not too educational and too boring because I've added a lot of things to it. So let's get started. It's all about making color your own way. There's no right or wrong way to do color. It's however you like to do it. It's an art choice. It's not a rule that you need to follow. If you like black and white and that's your thing, then do black and white. If you like straight photography with natural colors, then do straight photography. If you like altered colors and color for art's sake, then try some of these things. Even if you like some of the others, you may want to try some of this, and you decide what you want to do with it. I'm not an expert on this. There's people that are far better at color management than I am. This is a product of about 4 or 5 years of trying to figure this out. I've collected it all together to put it into a webinar because it's a huge subject that's been going on for centuries. These ways that I'm showing here are just a few of the ways to do it. I'm going to focus on Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop, and I'm going to cover one Mac Raw developer. You can use Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop. I don't use Lightroom, so I don't know if you can switch back and forth and use Lightroom as a filter or not. With Camera Raw, you can switch back and forth in and out of Photoshop with it as a filter, so it works well that way. And then if you use other raw developers and editors, they all do similar things. So you can translate this for those software. What you want to do with Photoshop is turn on your adjustments layer, adjustment menu, history, and actions. We're going to talk a lot about using lookup tables, which are Luts, and the channel mixer in adjustments in Photoshop Camera Raw. And you use the color mixer in Camera Raw to tweak adjustments. You use color grading and effects for tweaking the adjustments. I suggest you experiment with pushing clarity and dehaze sliders left because you want your images to have more than just color. You want them to have emotion and mystery. That makes better images. And sometimes bright, shiny images and digital cameras it takes all the mystery out. We're going to talk a little about the history. When color came along in the mid-century, there was a huge fight over it. The people responsible for launching it really in photography are William Eggleston and Stephen Shore. The existing photographers of the day didn't like it. Ansel Adams said, if you can't make it good, make it red. Robert Frank said the colors of photography are black and white. Walker Evans said it was vulgar. Stephen Shore said he liked postcards, and that's one of the reasons that attracted him to using it. And then William Eggleston always had a fight with Ansel Adams and said the zone system was BS. What I suggest to everybody is take a bunch of Robert Frank's pictures, for example, or maybe Walker Evans, and put them down next to William Eggleston and Stephen Shore, and look at the pictures and make your own decision about how each photographer made decisions about how they photographed the world, whether it was color or black and white. And you may find it interesting because they all had a profound effect on photography. Color theory is evolving, but we're gonna touch on it here a little bit. Ernst Haas says, beware of color theories. Theories in color photography are dangerous. The plain fact there are so many proves my point. A color philosophy comes much closer to the truth. And I think this presentation does do that. Ernst Haas, by the way, was the first color photographer to show at MoMA in New York City in 1962. So he was the guy that actually was the first one to have color images put up. In color theory, the basic color theory is there's warm and cool colors, contrasting colors, color tones, red attracts attention. There's a lot of little bits to it. We'll talk about them. I hope when you take photographs, you don't let worrying about what colors you're seeing get in the way of taking the photograph. You can edit it later And what's important is to get the photograph you see rather than miss it because you're worrying about what colors are in it. You can always play with that later. And after as you develop an eye for it, then it gets easier and easier. I'm going to talk about color and art. This is kind of the basics of color theories is these color wheels. A lot of people use them to introduce the concepts and tell people what to do. It's evolved a lot beyond this, but these are kind of the current way they're done. I've got a lot of links in this presentation. You'll see one of them here. It's called colormatters.com. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to have all these links on one page, and I'll put them on the webinar also, so you can look at some of these links because I think it matters that you digest it your own way because it's all about how you're going to use it. But basically, color theory is, like I said, it's warm and cool colors. It's complementary colors like red, green, orange, blue. There's compound colors like orange. There's pure colors like yellow, blue, and red. And you mix them together in different ways. There's a thing called color relativity, and I recommend this video. Your brain actually sees color by the colors that are next to it. If you look at this image in the photograph here, every single color in there is a shade of orange. Even though some of the trees look green and the water looks yellow in the background and whatever, all of that is orange. And that video will talk about how you do that, especially in cartoons. I think the guy that does it does animation. It's a really complicated thing. There's hue, tint, tone, shade, or different parameters of color. Color is just the general top level. Hue is the dominant color on the color wheel, like red, green, orange. Tint is the color plus white only. Tone is the hues and colors mixed with gray only. Pure color and hue is black only. So what's an interesting thing, you can memorize all this hue, tint, and tone. Then when people ask you about color, you can use those words and you'll sound really educated. If you're like me, you're not sure what all of them mean. But artists have been playing with these kinds of things for a long time. And there's a thing called a color wheel artist link there. And he talks a lot about all of this in ways that are easy to understand. One of the first things I recommend people do with photography when they want to start going deeper into color, or even black and white for that matter, is look at art, because it will help you also frame your photographs, compose your photographs, and decide how you want to use color in them. J.M. Turner was very famous for having hundreds of color tones in his photographs. Whistler went out on the Thames at night and looked at what it looked like out on the water in a boat. He did it many times in order to paint his night scenes. And I recommend you look at his work. It's very interesting. He uses green to symbolize night. And one of the many YouTube channels that I use to look at different kinds of art is called The Arts Hole 311. And the guy is a Scotsman who has a very tongue-in-cheek view of art. He's very knowledgeable of it, but he tells it like it is. So I kind of like it. And as you watch some of these videos about different artists and what they did, you may find you like modern art more. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Here's a couple of the people we're talking about. There's a Turner picture on the left. That's his most famous one, the Fighting Temeraire. And Whistler is the falling fireworks on the right side. That's also a very famous picture. And you can see in that picture how he uses green to symbolize darkness. And there's a video that's interesting to look at on YouTube that's listed below about how Turner made that picture with all those tones in it. He used every kind of paint you can imagine and every kind of technique and stacked one on top of another to get that photo, to get that painting. Why should you look at art? It's not important to like the artist. There's plenty of artists you can look at that you may not like their work at all. But you want to look at how they saw the world and how they captured it in art so you can steal it. I mean, Picasso said, good artists steal, bad artists copy. And so I think it will help your photography. Like I said, Whistler went out at night and looked how he captured it floating around in a boat in the Thames in the dark. You might do that with your own night photography. Go out and look and decide, how does it look? How does it feel? What colors do you see in the darkness? If you're going to photograph it and post-process it, how do you want to show darkness? What do the hints of shapes feel like? What do the shadows feel like? What mood do you want to project? And you can get some of that from art, and you can get that from going out and playing with your own photography at night. And you may find it's a lot of fun to do that. Again, don't just study the art style like Impressionism, Realism, Dadaism. Look at the artists. They're all weird in their own way and have interesting stories. It's worth looking what they did, how they lived, who they were, how they learned, and what they did, what they invented, who they got in arguments with, what they ended up painting at the end of their life, and how they contributed to these styles like Impressionism and Realism and whatever. It's an interesting rabbit hole to go down to figure out how they were actually doing this. The other thing that we're kind of talking about here is photography and art. And I don't think anybody has decided whether it's art or not. It might be. No, it's not art. Yes, it is. You might try Susan Sontag's essays about it. She has a very complex way of writing an essay. You kind of have to get past that. But once you do and start reading about how she talks about photography, you may find it interesting because she really does know photography extremely well. She's very dedicated to French photography only, of course, they're the best in the world. But when you get past that and look at it, you may find her essays are interesting. She actually ends up this book on photography by saying that photography encapsulates art, art doesn't encapsulate photography, which is kind of an interesting way to view it. But I leave it to you if you want to read it to figure out why she says that. Now we're going to talk a lot about the movies because movies in color are a big deal. Here's some of the general things that color might have an emotional impact, like red is danger, blue is peace, green is safety, black is sophistication. Don't take this with a big grain of salt, but it's kind of a general look at how colors can manipulate people's emotions or make them feel a certain thing by how you use a color. The Visit to the Seaside was the first color short. Flesh and the Devil was the first color feature, and they use a kinemacolor process. It was basically red and green. And I'm going to show a lot later that shows how that process looks. The first color cartoons were 1930, and then the most famous one you've heard of is Disney's Snow White in 1937. Part of this is Technicolor came along at the same time, and Walt Disney made agreements with them and contracts with them to use Technicolor, which is one of the reasons that Disney always had wonderful color. There's a 3-strip lookup table we'll show later that kind of emulates early Technicolor. And of course, Wizard of Oz is famous for being one of the first mainstream color movies that everybody has seen. If you look at this website, this YouTube site, a couple of these, the Emotion of Color and the Color Primer and the Black Magic Design, you'll see that movie colors, every scene in a movie today is color coded, color matched, color mixed, so that you get a certain feeling from the scene. The movie will have an overall color palette, but they will pull out each scene. And there's a piece of software called DaVinci Resolve, and you can download a free copy of it for manipulating videos. It is like Photoshop on speed. I mean, if you think Photoshop is complicated, you haven't seen anything till you've tried DaVinci Resolve. It does all of the same things as Photoshop. You can have layers and you can make a flow chart of all the adjustments that you go through, and you can speed up and slow down and move things around. It's incredibly complicated, sophisticated piece of software. You can put it on your computer and play with it. It's worth it when you're bored sometime to sit down and try to figure it out. But it is the kind of the main software that all the movie industry uses now, and all the YouTube people that make sophisticated color video. Now we're going to talk a lot about film. This is my opinion only. I think film has an amazing look to it. I think it is superior to digital. And like I said, digital is too sharp and perfect. It takes all the mystery out of things for me. Other people may love it. And that's the whole point. It's what you like. But there's a lot of people that like film. There's a lot of people shooting film, and there's a lot of movies being shot in film today. So the film look and color photography is a big theme as we go on with this presentation. And understanding how film and movies looks, I believe, can help you understand how you want to process your images, and what kind, when you're out, how you look at light and how you look at the basic image that you want to take, and the color palette in that image and things like that, if you're really into trying to do the most color adjusting. Like I said, film and movies is a big deal right now. In fact, film today is much better than it used to be. The old Kodachrome 64 was 6 stops of dynamic range. Modern Portra is 10 stops of range. And the prices are horrible. I don't know how anybody, especially a young person, affords film. But they do, and they shoot it. And I don't know what a roll of film costs now. It's more than $10. It's closer, it's like $20. And Kodak is kind of come around. They're making a little bit of money again with their film. Part of understanding how film works is looking at film stocks. And there's usually a 4-digit ID number that Kodak uses. And we'll talk a little about that, and we'll talk about that as it relates to Luts, because a lot of the Luts that are in Photoshop have these ID numbers. I like this image here from this movie, The Enemy Below, because I like the blues in it. This slate colored sky and all of the wonderful blues. And then they highlighted it all with those warm colors. I don't know. I tried to find out what film stock this was, and it might have been 5248. And you can get it from this Kodak page, because it talks about the chronology of film, and all the film stocks that Kodak ever made are listed in a table on that link. A lot of movies are shooting film. Oppenheimer is film. Man Called Otto, Killers of the Flower Moon. TV shows are shooting film. Succession. Euphoria used to use digital, and they use a purple and magenta palette. And this year they switched over to film. And again, there's a Kodak site there listed that talks about all of movies and film, and all of movies and television that's being shot on film. Some of the things again in film are its color, grain, shadows, focus, emotion, mystery. You know, the film is imperfect compared to digital. Yet I think it has more power, and the movie industry thinks it does too, or they wouldn't be spending all the money it takes to shoot a movie on film. Now we'll get into some of the things you can do to actually manipulate your images. color palettes, if you look at them, are the suite of colors that dominate an image or a movie or a video. The old CSI television, each one of those CSI programs had a different color palette. If you look at it and analyze it, the CSI Las Vegas was kind of a blue and gray. The one in New York was brown, and the one is in Miami was famous for being orange. So color palettes have been around for a long time, and how things are how pictures and movies are managed. Painters select their color palette. If you look at any of the art shows or watch people paint, they'll pick half a dozen paints as their palette, and then they will mix everything for the painting from that set of paints. Here's one of Bob Ross's paintings. On the left, you see the painting. On the right, you see the color palette. Those are the colors that are dominant in that painting. It's easier to see than describe. So here's some different color palettes from different photographs or movies. And you can see the palette underneath. There's like 12 or so different colors that are dominant in each one of those. And as you manipulate LUTs and presets and things like that, it will change that color palette. You can manipulate the color palette to make it different. Some of the things you can do to find color palettes that you want to use. If you see a photograph you love or a style of photograph or something, you can use that as color palette. You can use your old images. You can use old photographs. You can go to the art galleries and pull up paintings and use that color palette. I'll show you how to do it in a minute. You can also go to a site called colors.co and make color palettes. You can use black and white photographs like the ones on the lower right as a color palette. And you can put that on top of your black and white. One way to do it is use color match. And the photograph on the far left is just kind of a throwaway photograph I took with an iPhone. And then the color match, if you look at if you can see my cursor's not working, but it's in the images menu under adjustments, and it will drop down another menu that says match color. And when you activate that menu, you'll get another thing, the match color menu. And you can select the images you want to mix with another image. So I took that Durango Unchanged image and I mixed it with the image, that blue and green image that I took. And you can see how it shifted the color palette. It made it completely different. It moved it from the softer pastel colors to the yellows and greens. It changed the blues. So it made a whole different image. It makes, instead of looking like it was riding out at night, it almost looks like they're coming out in the morning. So you can do a lot by color match. And you don't have to, you can use opacity with this also. So you can do a color match that's only 50% opacity with Photoshop. So you can apply the color match without as much impact if you want. So there's all kinds of ways to use this. Here's an image I matched to the Turner. The image on the left is an old image from Northern California on the beach at Roberts Beach on a foggy morning. And I mixed it with the Fighting Temporary image using match color. And I got an image that I like. I like the red sand and things like that. I think it made an interesting image. It made the highlights in the water in front pop. It made the waves pop. You will find that color match doesn't necessarily give you the image you think. You can take a painting you really love and apply it to one of your images, and it will make just a mess out of it. This one is a similar image applied to a similar painting, and it produced a good result. And you can get a bad result just as easily. So it's fun to play with because occasionally you get something that works pretty well. Again, that's what I was saying. It isn't always what you expect. And you have to play around with it. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. The other thing that people have been using for several years is presets. Presets are basically use the Adobe application programming interfaces, which is what Adobe gives to third-party software developers so they can hook into their products in different places in the software, like Nick, like Topaz. When you use one of those programs inside of Photoshop, Photoshop allows it to operate in certain ways inside of Photoshop through what they call APIs. They effectively move the camera raw sliders around in the process an image when you execute a preset. That isn't that's kind of what they do. That's a lot of what they do, but it isn't literally what they do. They're actually inside the Adobe software applying changes to it in ways that Adobe allows. So it's the sliders are just a user interface, and that's that Adobe uses. So they're kind of a little bit different. Everybody's got presets. You can find them everywhere. Wedding photographers, event photographers, YouTube photographers, they all have presets telling you how wonderful these presets will make your images look. Camera Raw has many of these presets, and I'll show you in a minute how you find them. They're getting better than they used to, actually. I have a whole bunch of ones that I really like. I spent all of $12 on them. And again, they're all film emulations because that's what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for how to make good wedding photography. I was looking to how to emulate film. And this X equals, I bought like 50 presets for $12 that work reasonably well. If you go to that xequals.com website, they've changed it all around, and I don't know if they sell these presets anymore, or if you can find it on the website. I didn't try to find it. But there's other kinds of presets out there. There's so many, you'll go blind looking for them. Again, this is on the left there is the Camera Raw menu, and those little overlapping circles are the menu for your presets. If you click on that while you're using Camera Raw, you'll get this drop-down menu of Adobe presets. And you can see they have tons of them there, every kind you can imagine. And above it, you'll see the user presets, and you can add these to Camera Raw and Photoshop. And off on the right there is the X equals ones that I bought. And there's so many of them. There's like 7 or 8 of them that I like to use a lot. So you can make that a favorite. So when you click on the presets in the menu, it will come up with your favorites out of your user presets. It'll make a little list of them for you, so you don't have to wade through and try all the ones that you haven't used in a while and you don't know exactly how they work. Here's some examples of it. This is a famous clown motel in Tonopah. So the upper left is out of the camera, and then the black and white is a classic pan from X equals. Velvia I like to use, that saturates all the colors. That's a Fuji film. Below that is an Ilford Delta. And then on the lower left is a Kodachrome. So when you click the preset, this is what it does to your images. And again, once you do this, you can tweak all of this. You can set the opacity of the preset and all kinds of things. You could change the colors. One of the things I use a lot are lookup tables. And lookup tables are what the film industry uses, and they're pretty sophisticated, but they're very easy to use. They're a lookup table, and what they do is they take the colors in your image, and they take maybe 20 or 30,000 color swaps, and they apply them to your colors. So it changes one kind of blue to another kind of blue, one kind of orange to yellow, or whatever it is. And it will adjust maybe 20 or 30,000 colors in your image. So it's not a preset. It's not anything like a preset. It's actually changing the colors of your image. And the way you find them is you go into this adjustments in Photoshop, and you go to that little grid menu and you click on that, and it will pull down this thing, this color lookup, and you click on the load 3D LUT, and you get all these LUTs. You get a menu that looks just like the preset menu, but it's all the different LUTs. Now that menu there that you see on the right-hand side, it includes some that I have gotten for free online, as well as the many that Adobe has. And we're going to talk about some of those different ones here in a minute, how it actually works. You open your photo in Photoshop, and this again is the history menu. If you see, it's history, layers, and actions. This is just how I set up my Photoshop, but however you do yours, you can find these same menus, and you may put them in different places on your interface. Open the color adjustments with that little grid and select the LUT you want to use. And you see it says new color lookup layer. That's what it does when it executes the LUT. It does a double entry of that. If you use another LUT on top of a LUT, it isn't doing what you think it is. It's changing the colors that are changed. So you want to use the history menu. You want to go back and click on wherever you were before you did the lookup layer if you want to try another one. And you can compound them on top of each other. That works just fine. You can do 20 LUTs on top of each other and get something, but you'll never be able to repeat that. So I suggest you just use them one at a time. And if you use one, you go back above it and reset the photograph and then go use the LUT. This may sound a little complicated until you do it once, and then it's very easy. Over here, you can see some of the websites where you can get free LUTs. A lot of these are for movie makers. And so they drop right into the presets files on Mac Photoshop folders. You basically just take them, you download them, and you drag them over and drop them into the presets file. It's that hard to put them into Photoshop, and then you restart Photoshop. I have no clue how you do that on a PC. None at all. So the PC users will have to figure out how to put them in their Adobe Photoshop. So this is kind of what they do. The picture on the left there is from last summer at the pier, Santa Monica Pier. And then at the right is a Kodak 2393 by Adobe. That's an Adobe LUT that comes with your Photoshop. And it's a Fujifilm that is emulated by Adobe. And again, you see that 2393 is a Kodak number. That's a film stock. I loved what this did to it because I like green skies. And I like how it changed, oversaturated the blues and added a tint of green to them. It darkened things. It made them look really super saturated. So this LUT with this picture worked, and for me, worked great. You can see what it did to the wood, how it made the wood pop. A different LUT will do a completely different thing. If you don't like this much color, you just dial back the opacity in Adobe a little bit, and it will apply the LUT softer. So there's all kinds of ways to change it. Here's some different ones. This is out in the middle of Nevada last summer. The one on the left is out of the camera. I have a bunch of film LUTs. I have a Fuji Velvia. You can see what it did to the colors. Underneath it is a Kodak 5205, and that's a free LUT in Photoshop. And there above that one on the right-hand side, you see the Kodak 2393. That's the one from the previous slide. And you can see in this one, it made the skies a softer blue with just a touch of green in them. So depending on the photograph you have, the LUT's going to operate a little differently. And you can try different ones to get the look that you want. Here's a picture from Los Angeles walking around with the club last year, the original. And then at the bottom, you can see the 3-strip. We talked about that as the 1937 Technicolor previously. I suggest that people who like straight photography and landscape photography give that one a try because it gives you a Technicolor look, like a Technicolor movie. And above it to the right is the uh, kinema, kinematic LUT that was green and red, which was the very first color movies. And that has an interesting look to it also. And there's, all the others do different things. Like I said, you can adjust it with the color mixer in Camera Raw. So you can call Camera Raw as a filter and use the color mixer. You can change it with a PS blending, like screen, overlay, darken in the layers menu. You can change the opacity. One of the things you may find in all of this as you start using this, if you do, is orange is something you usually have to adjust. At least I have to adjust to get the looks that I want in my photographs. You may find you adjust yellow, sometimes red and blue. You may find that also that the thing that color photographers complain about a lot is green is really difficult to adjust in any photograph and get that straight photograph that you like. Here's what's called a Ridley Scott Black Hawk Down LUT. And this is a little carnival in Simi Valley last summer. The photos on the left, and then I applied the Black Hawk Down LUT. And again, it made the skies green, which is what I like. A lot of photographers will, oh my God, a green sky, you can't have that. But I like it. I think it looks like summer to me. And you can see what it did to the reds. It made them orange. And it made the shirts on the people there orange. And it made the ticket booth, around the ticket booth, purple. So it's changing a lot of things. It's changed the trees in the back. They look a little more faded. What I did then is I opened Camera Raw as a filter in Photoshop and used the color mixer. And I set it up to adjust color. And I used orange and I pushed orange tint all the way over to red. And what it did is it made the shirts red again and fixed the reds, and it made the sky more of a teal color. So I really liked how that came out. I wanted the red shirts. The orange shirts look fine. I just happened to know they were red. So I liked that. But you can see what it did. It makes it look like summer at the carnival to me. That's the feeling I get from the photograph. You may want to have the blue skies. You may want to use a different LUT that keeps everything accurate colors. But once you do, then you can go into the raw files or the Camera Raw and adjust your colors however you want. You can fix the colors in the image that you want to fix, or change them, make them different. Now it's a little manual processing. I like vintage photographs and trying to make things look like finished photographs. It's another way to do color, another way to use Photoshop. It's a little different than color, but I thought I would throw this in because it's something you may enjoy doing. You can find a ton of editing techniques for Tintype and Collodion are the two I use. I've also played with lithograph looks. You can use cyanotypes and photogravures and everything, gelatin silver. You can play with photographs using Photoshop tools and kind of some cookbook ways of using Photoshop. And I'll show you a couple of them here that I like. If you look at a tintype there, that's kind of what they look like, especially now after they've turned yellow and faded and everything. There was a photographer went to Sundance a couple years ago, 2015, took pictures of celebrities with a tintype. And a lot of them really liked it. I think it was a different way. People that had their pictures taken as their business liked having a completely different way of doing it. It's a complex way to do it. You have to do things to simulate the lens You have to adjust the focus and the highlights and the focus and the shadows differently. You add grain to it. You have to put a paper texture on it. And you have to add flaws and light leaks and stuff to it. Does this something you want to do? I suggest you try something like this because it helps you understand how Photoshop works and how to use all the pieces of Photoshop. It's kind of like a little class in Photoshop. It can be incredibly frustrating the first time you do it because it doesn't really work like the menu says. And it takes a while to figure it out. You use things like a gradient map. You use things like curves, and you adjust the midtones and the highlights, and you push the darks to a little lighter. Then you have to put a texture on top of it to damage your photograph, because that's what these old photographs look like, and that's an incredibly important thing to do to it. Then you fool around with blending and soft light and brushes and whatever you want to clean it up. And it's fun to play with. I recommend you try it. Here's a picture on the left of a couple dogs I had. And here's the tintype I made out of it. And you see when I made the tintype, it took the window out completely, which is perfect. But I think makes an interesting picture. And you may find that it's something that you want to try. Collodion is a wet plate collodion. It's a completely different thing. It's one of the earliest forms of photography where the plate was literally wet when they took the photograph. And this you use the channel mixer a lot in this one, and that's another Adobe tool. And once you use it, it's not hard to use, but you have to look a few things online and figure out how to use it. And it changes your color channels, and you can set them to the color channel to be whatever you want. Here's a Collodion picture. The one on the left I took in January, and I went out and took some pictures of oak trees for no other reason than to go try to make Collodion pictures with it. And again, that's the picture on the right that I came up with. And there's nothing special about it. It's just I was playing around trying to figure out how to do this better. And I like the dark and the out of focus, and a lot of people wouldn't care for that, especially if they only do digital, because digital is supposed to be sharp and perfect and clear, and it's supposed to show everything. For me, it's fun to make a photograph like this, and I like the look of that because I think it has more emotion in it than the one on the left. Another thing you can use is Photoshop actions. Actions were very popular with Photoshop 10 years ago. They're not as big now. I don't see as many internet things talking about actions, but there are actions out there, and you can make your own. They're not. You can go through an editing process and basically copy it into an action and save it as your own action, and then run the action every time you want a photograph to look like the editing that you did on that, and it will just automatically go through each step. Now this one I use as a GRIIIx 400 action. Again, it's a film that I was trying to emulate because Nick does tricks and all kinds of other films, but it never seems to look exactly like the film. I think this one looks pretty good a lot of the time. The action itself does a lot of things to make the photograph look like film. It adds halos around things. It adds glow around things. It puts grain in. Unfortunately, it puts grain in with Nick. And if you see those little check marks, you can turn off different steps in the action. The action you see above where you see a file and it says digital GRIIIx, and the check mark is on. That means you can run that action by putting your cursor on the, say, process 35 millimeter. You highlight that, and then you push that little triangle at the bottom, and it'll run the action all the way down from that point to the end where it says finalize. In the middle of that, it has a Nick. It calls Nick Silver Effects Pro to put grid in, or to put grain in. And if you don't have Nick, or you have a newer version, it probably doesn't work. So I turn off the grain by unchecking that where it says grain 35 millimeter and grain 645. And then the whole action works fine. And I can add grain on with raw later, because with film, you really need to have grain in it to make it look good. So here's how that action works. This is in Palm Springs last summer. This is a Polish photographer I was talking to who was shooting a wedding in Las Vegas. And he was walking around taking street photographs. I like how that made it look like GRIIIx. I like how it did the blacks and the highlights. And in this kind of picture where you have a lot of saturated colors and you have good exposure and all kinds of things like that, the action works really great. So I really like the look of that. I could probably do that with special black and white Nick, but this does it with a push of a button. There's other raw developers, and I'm just going to touch on one of them here. Adobe Capture Raw, of course, is popular, and it's the same engine that runs Lightroom. You can buy for Mac users only, it doesn't work for PC. You can buy a thing called Raw Photo Processor 64. It's shareware, and they ask for $20, and I don't mind that. It's cheap. The person that created this is a photography professor or something, and he had help from a photographer in Eastern Europe who set up all the film curves for it. And I think he did a really good job of it. And you can download this and play with it if you have a Mac. So here's a picture from Palm Springs up on the left. And then here is what the interface looks like for this processor. And what I did is I made it look like V50, which is Velvia 50 Fujifilm. And you can see what it did. And it makes really an interesting, more like film look to me. It took all the yellows out and it changed the greens. But it's completely different way to process it. You know, Adobe would have a color palette and a way of adjusting it that's completely different from this. Other raw developers will look different. So there's nothing right about how your camera palette looks or Adobe looks. Just because you process it in Adobe doesn't mean that's the correct way the image is. That just means the way that's Adobe sees it. And you can find all kinds of other ways to process your images that are different than Adobe. And that is it. So thank you. And here are all the links.